We have here with us Prabhjeet Singh and Anil Kumar would be having a discussion over the same. So hello, Prabhjeet. Welcome to the discussion.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for having me.
The pleasures are ours. I believe Anil is also here. So Anil, over to you.
Thank you, Jal. Hi, good afternoon, Prab. Pleasure to host you.
Always a pleasure to meet you, Anil.
So, Prab, I think in interest of time, let me just start firing the questions straight away. And last 2 years have been very interesting for overall tech economy, and of course, specifically for mobility, where COVID and COVID-induced lockdowns have not been very kind to mobility sector. So maybe my first question would be to start with, what are the latest updates on this sector recovery, and what has been your observation on speed and shape of the recovery, third wave's impact, and view of the rest of 2022 in terms of the recovery?
Absolutely. First, I must compliment Anil for Siddharth capturing the strong insights on the category very crisply. I think he touched upon some of this. The reality is the last 2 years have not just been a health crisis, but a humanitarian crisis. And one of the biggest sectors which got impacted was mobility. When people stopped moving, it also meant that the shared mobility space did get impacted. And the impact typically would end up stretching much longer. The encouraging sign is threefold. One is wave after wave, which we have seen that the pace of recovery of the category is faster. Post-wave to the recovery was far faster. Post-wave 3, we are seeing a significant acceleration of the recovery. Second thing, which is also super interesting, is we have seen a strong influx of new consumers to the category irrespective. Even as some of the traditional users, say particularly commute users or folks traveling to and fro from the airport, began to travel much lesser, we could see a completely new segment come into the category, which I believe will power the future growth of the category, which some of the projections spoke about. The third shift we have also seen during this window is that the pace of recovery has been different by different categories, in some form reflecting the core use cases. Siddharth did touch upon some of it, but we have seen part of the portfolio, like three-wheeler and two-wheeler, recover rapidly. In fact, all these categories are now much larger than what it was before the pandemic, which signals that the pandemic has actually brought in a new set of users to grow these categories. We've also seen some of the other categories like intercity grow much faster and being much larger than what it was before the pandemic. The category which is still recovering is the core intracity business, which often tends to be over-indexed on either airport travel or commute travel. And I'm pretty optimistic as people start coming back to work, as offices reopen post-wave 3, some of that will also see a reasonably strong comeback. So I continue to be very long on the future of the category. Yes, there have been near-term stresses, I think, which we have all have to navigate, particularly driver partners in the community. And I'm confident of the direction this is going to.
Interesting. So, Prab, you said there's a bit of change in the way the overall mobility is structured now versus where the mobility sector was pre-COVID. So do you see some of these intercity and other modes which you spoke about, which have done better than the pre-COVID, to stay where they are, or as the things would start going back to normal, they would fizz out and the composition would start looking pretty similar to the pre-COVID?
Well, across the mobility space, what we have seen is, look, the core value proposition which shared mobility platforms offer of affordability, safety, and convenience are as relevant post the pandemic as they were earlier, are as relevant to an intracity segment or as they are to an intercity segment. These are large, unorganized revenue pools, which are at the cusp of getting digitized. The pandemic only triggered that digitization and is going to accelerate that. There is no reason why a consumer or a driver, a consumer who is now used to, when they're going from Mumbai, Pune, to have the same convenience of pressing a button, get a car on their doorstep, why they would go away to try and pre-schedule a booking with the local taxi operator, do it much in advance, and end up paying 30-40% more premium on that. There's no reason why the consumer should shift to that. On the other hand, on the driver side, there is many drivers who were earlier not on shared mobility platforms have discovered by being there, they can add additional earnings. They can still choose to drive 4 hours, 5 hours through their own personal networks. And maybe for 2 trips of the day, when they're coming back from say, Pune to Mumbai or going the other direction, they may choose to use a ride-sharing platform. So there is that digitization which will get accelerated. I don't see a strong reason why it should get impacted. I think the second driver also is we are beginning to see a fundamental appreciation of the long-term value of which a tech platform brings. You know what the past history of the driver is. You know that there have been background checks which have been done. You do know that there is no need for haggle. You do know in case of an emergency, there is a safety line. You do also know that in case of unpleasant experience, you can reach out to someone who will be able to try and resolve to the best of their ability. So there are elements which now Indian consumers who are very discerning are beginning to expect as table stakes.
Interesting. So, so basically what you're saying is, as we've seen in other sectors, acceleration of digitization, that's what has happened on mobility, and both on the supply side as well as demand side. Are there any interesting lessons or trends which you've seen from the global trends from Uber's perspective? Because Uber, of course, is a global mobility play, and which could have implications for India market as well.
Anil, let me first call out the things which we have seen as similar. I think what we have seen similar to what's happening in emerging market like India is as cities open up, the mobility business comes bouncing back. We're seeing that pattern across multiple geographies. In fact, as a global portfolio, we are able to then get the benefit of certain geographies making up for others when given the way the pandemic has played out. What is also very similar is that across the board, the long-term benefit of shared mobility has been recognized. Nowhere are we seeing a shift back from shared mobility to private ownership. In fact, if anything, that acceleration is happening. I remember debate first few months of the pandemic, there was a debate to say, look, will people actually shift back to private vehicles? We have not seen that happen in any geography globally. So I think that is very encouraging to the value which the category is bringing. In some of the more developed markets, there are 2 or 3 other themes which we are seeing, and I do expect that to also play out in India over a period of time. Number one is sustainability as an agenda is becoming far more center stage. Cities, policymakers are reimagining, thanks to the pandemic, how they want the future of cities to be. They want the cities to be more livable. They want the cities to be less congested. They want the cities to be far more vibrant and have open spaces. As a result, we're actually seeing cities come up with policies which will accelerate shared mobility. And along with that, there's a definitive access to say, how do we make this acceleration sustainable, which would be clean fuel as a big dialogue within that. Second shift we're also seeing is towards multimodality, where as we sit with policymakers and city planners, there's a real dialogue to say, how can the same technology, which is right now solving for first and last mile, become far more integrated with public transit? Can we find ways for unified journey planning as an example? You open the app, if you're going from making it up, Gurgaon to Connaught Place in Delhi, you should be able to just press the button and you should have, say, a 2-wheeler coming and picking you up. You go to the metro station, you are able to actually already have a ticket booked through the same Uber app. You then step out and there is an Uber pool vehicle waiting for you to take you to Connaught Place. And maybe in the evening, you are going from Connaught Place to Meerut, there's an intercity which you can then use. And you have been able to plan all the legs in a seamless digital manner. So now city planners are beginning to actually talk to platforms and say, look, how do we make that a reality? Because the value is very evident. And the last is truly around, I think, a fundamental acknowledgement around that how cities have to shape up in the future has to be different. Looks like there are elements of work from home which will continue, which also means it will allow the cities to expand further externally. It will also allow cities like tier 2, tier 3, potentially to have users operating from there. And thereby we could see the need for shared mobility, particularly tech platforms, grow in these pockets even more. And I think Siddharth's presentation alluded to that also.
Interesting, I think thanks for sharing this whole vision of connected mobility and planning a complicated and complex multi-leg trip in a one single button. It definitely sounds very, very interesting. Just to maybe take a step back, I think in the beginning today morning we were talking about as the digitization is penetrating further and further into the smaller cities, we're seeing more than 600, 700 million, actually more than 600 million customers which are tied to the smartphone now. They have access to smartphone right now, and these suppliers, the platforms need to really solve for a very different kind of needs as you start moving from the large cities to smaller cities. And it's not only just about infrastructure, it is about vernacular, it's about the kind of habits they have, and so on. Just applying the same construct on mobility, I think I have sort of a couple of observations, right? So if you look at the challenges which mobility was facing even before, shared mobility was facing even before COVID, and that was the moment you start moving away from the top 10 cities, the adoption of shared mobility was very, very low. And second, I think once you start moving deeper into these smaller cities, the ask of mobility in itself would be pretty much very different from what the current set of platforms are really providing. So how is Uber planning to really look at a wider adoption of shared mobility beyond the top cities? How do we really make sure that the way we've seen the e-commerce and some of the product commerce picked up pretty big way in the across the board population, it would happen for the smaller, it would happen for shared mobility as well?
I think that's a very, very astute observation, Anil, and you called out the core challenge. Even before the pandemic, the penetration of shared mobility was still very much centered around the top 14, 15 cities. And we do believe that long-term, we will see a much faster growth beyond the top cities. I think that from our lens, there are 2 or 3 shifts which we are looking to invest in. And this is not a journey for 1 year, 2 years. This is a journey for 10 plus years. Number one is to make sure that we are able to provide a form factor and a price point which will be relevant for a smaller city, which tends to also be far more price sensitive. The use cases are not as commute driven as they happen to be in a Delhi or a Mumbai. And as a result, we are seeing the accelerated growth in 3-wheelers and 2-wheelers in these markets far more. As Siddharth alluded, a price point of 20 to 25 rupees a kilometer is not going to be relevant. The use cases of high congestion travel for a long trip to workplace is not going to exist. So we're going to see 3-wheelers and 2-wheelers, and that product market fit is now beginning to play out. We're now in 100 cities. Many of these cities are auto first cities, for example, where we haven't launched. Imagine a consumer, their first visualization of Uber, there is not a air-conditioned car, but their visualization is a yellow-green auto turning up at their doorstep. It is something which I don't think 5 years back one could have visualized. And we can now see that happening in 2-wheelers turning up, and even e-rickshaws turning up, but with the same technology which can be alluded to. I think the second thing is around solving for access. Obviously, language is one of them. I think that's the journey we have already been on. The apps are available in multiple languages. Our support systems are aligned for both drivers and riders to be able to deal in multiple languages. But what we are also solving for is access, where there is, despite the smartphone penetration, there is still a segment of users within the smartphone. They're comfortable using, say, WhatsApp, but not yet comfortable downloading a Uber app just for traveling, for reasons which we can debate separately. So what we're doing is, rather than try and change behavior, we are adapting our product to the way the consumers operate. So for example, we are running a pilot with WhatsApp to how can, just by through 4 or 5 steps, requesting to the WhatsApp window by messaging a number, you can actually have the same experience, or a similar experience at least, to booking an Uber ride. You don't need the Uber app. You can get a similar experience. The vehicle turns up, your location will be picked up from the phone. So that should be a pretty interesting move to tackle these segments. And last but not the least is going to be really around partnerships. I think we recognize that it is in a complex environment like India, which are each city, each state is like a separate country. Say, if you compare to a market like Europe, you need to be able to adapt locally. There will be fleet partners which we are partnering with, which are unique to each location. We're also partnering with other third-party platforms who have already built penetration in these geographies, and making sure that we are able to be relevant. For example, it could be a payments partner who has a deeper penetration, say in Coimbatore. And we are able to then partner with them to say, look, how do we find a way to create customized offers for those users? So I think this is not just an individual effort. It will be a team sport. I'm pretty confident that we will be able to build relevance, not just for the next 100 cities, but for the next 400 and 500 cities.
Got it, Prab. Prab, when it comes to shared mobility, we often talk about that it's a supply constrained market. And if we have the supply, we would be able to get into the deeper part of the cities, smaller cities, and so on. I think interestingly, I mean, I come from a very, very small city next to Agra, and I was traveling there last October, and when I had to go to my village, I was able to I found Uber and Ola to be the most reliable source of getting to that place. It of course turned out to be one-way journey because there are no takers for Uber and Ola when they are coming from the village. So from a supply side, we were able to, at least in some of these examples, we are able to see that we're able to get supply in some of these smaller cities, in smaller towns and villages. But when you look at the socio-economic condition and ability of people to really afford or even ask for such kind of modes of transportation, the demand is not there. So I think it's a bit of a catch-22 situation. Large cities, supply is a challenge. In small cities, probably even demand is not there. How do you at Uber are really solving for and looking at the supply-demand challenges in these kind of cities?
That's a very fair observation, Anil. I think at the heart of it, what platforms like us do is connect supply pools to demand pools. And at the end of the day, the face of the service is the individual driver or a fleet partner which is providing that service. I think first, before I talk about the long term, it's important to acknowledge that our drivers have gone through a very challenging last 2 years. The earnings were impacted while we as platforms leaned in heavily, whether it be on direct funding, whether it be on vaccination support, whether it be on medical consultation, whether it be in championing access to ECLGS schemes in partnership with financiers. There has been an impact on sentiment, and the pace of new supply creation for particularly four-wheelers has taken a hit, and that's very obvious. Part of it has also gotten accentuated when there was a chip shortage, new vehicles not being delivered, etc. So I think the way I look at the future of supply is we have to, on the core, if you look at the cars category, which is where we are beginning to see significant demand acceleration in the top cities. I do believe the future will involve finding ways to make it easy for drivers to get access to vehicles. There's a dichotomy. Often people who have debated have heard me say, the way the ride-sharing regulations in a market like India are structured, it requires, unfortunately, often a poor man to buy a rich man's asset before he or she can start earning a livelihood. And that fundamentally is a premise which will not scale the category as much. How do we make sure that we make it easy for access to vehicles and not add additional burdens, additional taxation on commercial vehicles, go through the process of additional checks on those vehicles, with commercial insurance being more expensive? I think there needs to be a fundamental shift. Additional taxes. Every time you cross a Delhi-Gurgaon border, you pay 100 rupee as an additional tax, right? Which also increases the cost of the ride. So we have to find a way, and the regulators have to find a way to make shared mobility more attractive, so that then the more drivers can come into the category, because there is a very large opportunity to add livelihood through these categories. I think the second thing, which I do believe is the dichotomy we need to solve. At the end of the day, the commercial vehicles are less than 6 to 7% of total vehicles in any city. We have to find a way to use the private vehicles which are sitting for the large cities. Those vehicles are sitting idle 96% of the time. When they are used, they probably will have on an average 1.2 passenger. When every developed market, thanks to technology, and even emerging markets, say Bangladesh, which also comes in our portfolio, has enabled private ride sharing, I believe that has to be a solution. There is massive demand pools. For that to be solved, we need to make it easy for commercial supply to be created and in our private vehicles to be on the road. I think to me, that's a large city answer. I think the small city answer is going to be different. It is going to be using existing assets like three-wheelers and two-wheelers. There are bikes and autos in these locations. I think the technology should be utilized for them to make it easy to come on the platform.
Do you see the private vehicles coming anytime soon to Uber and Ola?
Look, it's early. The regulatory frameworks are not as enabling as we believe they should be. But I can also say that across multiple dialogues which we have with policymakers in states at the federal level, there is a real appreciation of the problem, because India can't afford fundamentally the chance of going through deep private car ownership. Today, we have less than 30 cars for every 1,000 population. The number in US is upwards of 800. We can't afford to go through that. Our cities and infrastructure can't take that. I am confident that over a period of time that will happen. If it's not a 1 year, 2 year agenda, it's again, I said, it's a multi-decade agenda, but that should hopefully open up. And no reason why, with the help of technology, that shouldn't happen. But at the same time, I think coming to the core structure as it exists today, we have to still make it easy for drivers and fleets to be able to put even commercial cars on the road, take away the burden of extra taxation, take away the extra burden of them having to pay additional taxes every year. And I think that will help also accelerate the growth of this category. Remember, one vehicle on the road on a shared mobility platform is equal to about 12 to 13 private vehicles. If one vehicle is on the road, they're doing 12 to 13 trips. That many number of cars have not left their garage in the day. And that is the world which we need to move towards.
Very interesting, Prab. And you made a very very powerful statement, poor men acquiring the asset of a rich man to earn living. And that sort of brings us to a very important question, and maybe a controversial question. The shared mobility platforms have been often accused of predatory pricing and malpractices towards the drivers and partners. Now, maybe if you can shed a bit light on this, how much of it is because this whole concept about drivers have to actually acquire a big capex, and then of course whatever they earn, this has to really knock off the capex as well, and that's where they lag, and how much of it is because there's not a fair pricing or fair earning capabilities or opportunities which platform is providing?
Anil, I'll actually go back to what Siddharth's presentation and your core thesis also was. Eventually, shared mobility is growing in an accelerated manner, more than 40% year on year, and which actually is showing that there is a lot more opportunity being created in the market across the board. Today, ride-sharing platforms have barely scratched the surface. And there is, I don't even see why there is a question of what you call the quote-unquote predatory practice. Let me give you some data points. Over the last 5 to 6 years, there would have been more than 2 million plus livelihood opportunities which have got created additionally, thanks to ride-sharing platforms. And that number can be 10x if you are able to unlock enabling environment. Number two, today, ride-sharing platforms still are serving less than 5% of the total India opportunity, because the product market fit is still happening. The pandemic obviously had a significant impact on the category. The categories are still a very tiny component of what the total mobility space is. So I don't think there's a question of being predicted. I think at the end of the day, it is contingent on the platforms to make sure that the drivers who are micro entrepreneurs coming onto the platform have a fair, transparent earning, which then encourages them to stick to the platform longer. And in the long term, whoever is able to do that will continue to do well in the market. I think that the three imperatives for any platform, and I'm hoping that we are setting the tone of that as an industry leader on this. Number one is to make sure that we have to make it easy for people to join the platform, make it a seamless process, make sure that you are able to get access to easy financing and fair financing schemes. You are able to get complete transparency on the effort to reward ratio when you come on the platform. That's something which we hold very dearly. Second is, once you come on the platform, it is important that the earnings proposition, number one, is very fair and compelling. At the same time, non-earnings proposition, how we, for example, provide on-trip insurance, how we provide micro loans for drivers to be able to get a loan for their child's education. How are we able to provide them support during the kind of the crisis which hit us over the last 2 years as a category? I think those also make a big difference, which, by the way, would lead to their satisfaction and stickiness with the platform. And third is to make sure that over a period of time, as earners increase their earnings, if some of them want to upgrade to more vehicles, if they want to pursue other opportunities, we are able to create a path for them. So, for example, there are vehicles which will reach end of life, right? A commercial vehicle typically will have a certain life. How do we make sure that there are, in partnership with financiers, that options are available for them to upgrade? Look, and it's an ongoing journey for us to make sure that we create a happy and a productive earner, because then only he or she can provide the service which we stand for.
Absolutely, Prab. So if we just go to the regulatory part, and we know that government regulation have not been very kind to the mobility sector, at least have not been very efficiently applied. So if there are top 2 or 3 asks which you have to really go back to government with and say that, hey, look, these are 2 or 3 things which will help the shared mobility sector grow and help the overall ecosystem better, what would be those?
And before I answer that, I do want to just react to your statement. I don't think the regulatory environment's not being favorable. I would actually say I am deeply appreciative that over the last few years, the way state governments, federal governments, policymakers across the spectrum have embraced shared mobility. And that has actually enabled the sector to grow. And even as we speak, there is just a very forward-looking dialogue, which we have heard in multiple transport departments with the Ministry of Road and Transport, and huge compliments to the policymakers around it. Having said that, there are a few areas which I think will further accelerate the growth of this category. Number one, right? There is a breakthrough regulatory framework on the earner side called the Code on Social Security, which the government has drafted, which is on the cusp of becoming a reality. This was passed by the Indian Parliament in 2020 and marks India as one of the first countries to establish a framework for nationwide social security benefits and encourages platforms to find a way to support the earners in a very structured manner. What it does is it sets a precedent by transforming what has been a binary choice between full-time and independent work and takes away the challenge for earners to choose between one or the other, right? And that I think is huge credit. We're going to encourage, and we continue to, through different forums, encourage the government to implement this code. It will really be a big support for drivers. As we speak, we're already encouraging drivers on our platform, for example, to sign up to the e-Shram portal. I think it will give them access to multiple such benefits. The second thing, we continue to urge the governments across federal and the state level is a very recent shift which had happened. We spoke about two-wheelers as a category which is growing the fastest. Siddharth's presentation talked about it. Ride sharing is still less than 10% of what the total 2-3-wheeler categories could be. But however, from Jan 1, we have a situation of an unequal playing field where every trip which happens, say, on an Uber or an Ola or any other ride-sharing platform, the rider has to pay that 5% on behalf, or the driver has to pay that extra 5% as GST, which the platforms would typically collect from the rider. The same driver doesn't have to do that on an offline trip. Now, suddenly, you have created an unequal platform where a hail trip, which is the example which Siddharth gave, right? He brought that to example, a hail trip where the driver is negotiating the fare, becomes suddenly 5% more economically viable. And that will fundamentally hurt the growth of a digitized category. We do believe that online auto trips are safer, they're digital, you are able to provide support where required, and that should actually be encouraged. But this move ends up discouraging. I think the last kind of summation I have is, which I spoke about eventually, and again, would defer to the policymakers on the right timing. We have to find a way to start utilizing the private vehicles which are sitting in garages, parked on the side of the roads, which are used only once or two times in the day. Why can't they be utilized more actively? Technology solutions allow that to happen. We can put checks and balances to make sure there are very high levels of safety. So I think that's something I hope one of the forward-looking governments will be able to embrace that, and we will be able to, at least through maybe regulatory sandboxes, show evidence and results from running private ride-sharing pilots in the country.
Got it. Great. No problem. I think all these insights have been really very, very helpful, and coming from someone who's been running Uber in India and South Asia, I think they are very very powerful for us and for our audience. Definitely, we are going back with some key insights. I would like to thank you, and on behalf of RedSeer and all our participants, it's been a pleasure hosting you today.
Thank you, Anil. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much.